you. All right. Okay, is that loud enough for everybody? Great. Welcome. Thank you for having me today. My name is Sydney Mauck, and I'm our military collection specialist at History Colorado. I'm also the museum's representative for the 10th Mountain Division Resource Center. So it is my job to actually care for the archives and the artifacts for the historic World War II division. And so that's what led me to work on the Winter Warriors exhibit that we have there that tells the story of the World War II division, and what leads me here today to talk about Camp Hale and the Mauck detachment that was stationed there during World War II. All right, so to begin our story and how the Maucks ended up here, we have to talk about the creation of the 10th Mountain Division, starting at the beginning of World War II. So our story opens with the rise of the Axis powers in both the Pacific and in Europe, so that's the Japanese, the Nazis, and the fascists in Italy. And when Hitler invades Poland in 1939, that starts World War II. And so at the time, the United States was in a period of isolationism. After World War I, we had decided that we kind of want to remove ourselves from getting involved in other countries' conflicts. But we were paying attention to what was going on in Europe at the time, specifically one conflict that was going on in Finland. So in November of 1939, the Russians come in and are trying to take back Finland. They had previously had that as a territory, but the Finnish won their independence during World War I, and the Russians weren't too happy about that. And so they think it's going to be an easy conflict, an easy victory to regain that territory. But it's not so. Instead of taking maybe 3 weeks to take over the country, the conflict ends up lasting 5 months. And the Finnish end up maintaining their independence through the rest of the war, and it's largely due to their mountain warfare troops that they have. The Finnish have ski troopers that are well equipped to fight in snowy and mountainous conditions, which proved difficult to the Russians, and so they maintain their independence the rest of the war, and the Russians back off. And now there are several key figures that are paying attention to conflicts like that. One being Charles Minnie Dole, who is the founder of the National Ski Patrol. He is a gentleman from the back east, an avid skier in the northeast, and after several ski accidents, he forms the National Ski Patrol in order to help other injured skiers off the mountain. And so he writes the Army Chief of Staff at the time, who is George C. Marshall, and is like, hey, I think that we should have some kind of mountain warfare unit in the Army just in case we have to go to war in the Alps, because at this time the Austrians and the Germans had several dedicated mountain warfare divisions and we had 0. And now Marshall was very keen on that idea. At the time in 1939, there were only 189,000 men in the Army. And so he needed to mobilize because we needed to get up to 8 million men because he knew that we were likely going to go to war eventually. And so he was very keen on that idea. He signs off on it. And so he partners with the National Ski Patrol to begin recruiting men for this so-called Winter Warfare unit. And that begins the start of the 10th Mountain Division. And so a peacetime draft is enacted in 1940, and so men are selected between the ages of 21 and 36 are beginning to be drafted into the Army. And so if they come from some kind of outdoorsman background, let's say skiing, mountaineering, camping, even other skills like gold panning and orienteering were all sought after skills. And so if they had them, they were encouraged to apply for the 10th Mountain Division. And so they'd fill out an application and have to submit 3 letters of recommendation. And if they were accepted, they would receive a postcard in the mail. And then after basic training, they would be sent off to join the mountain troops. And now they didn't train initially here in Colorado. That's what leads eventually to the creation of Camp Hale. But the 1st Regiment, which was the 87th Regiment, ends up training first in Fort Lewis, Washington, which is right at the base of Mount Rainier. So perfect area still for skiing and mountaineering training. But they begin to grow in size. The 87th eventually grows to having 3 battalions, so there are at least 2,000 men there. And so the Army recognizes that this division needs to have their own dedicated camp. And so in the summer of 1941, Army surveyors are sent out around the country country to find that most ideal location to put in a training camp for the division. And so they're looking in areas in the Pacific Northwest, in Idaho, in Montana, and even considering Yellowstone at one point, because it had, ideal training areas, before they eventually select the Pando Valley here in Colorado. Now, with a show of hands, how many of you have been up to Camp Hale before? Super, all right, that's awesome. And so, yeah, just about 45 minutes west of here, we have the Pando Valley right off of Highway 24. And so what made the Pando Valley very suitable for the 10th Mountain Division was that at the time it was on an active railroad line. So unlike today, we didn't have the interstate system yet, and so it was very difficult to get into the mountains. So having an active rail line made it easier for them to bring up supplies and the men themselves from Denver. So that was a huge, huge factor in choosing that site. At this time, as many of you might know, especially living in the mountains, it experiences heavy snowfall. So that also made it a suitable camp, especially for winter warfare training. It also had enough space and water to support up to 20,000 personnel, because that's what they expected to have a full division up there at the camp, which is 20,000 people. So they had to have enough water and land to house all of them. And as well, just the topography of the area. The Rocky Mountains provided great training space for both skiing and mountaineering. So compared to the other areas, it was the best. Now, it did have its own challenges, and it was an engineering feat constructing it. For example, they had to rechannel the Eagle River that went through the valley floor because it was a marshland. So they had to change the river's channel and then raise the valley floor by 8 feet so they could put 1,000 buildings down there, which is crazy. And then it was a really cool effort as well. They brought in a lot of civilian contractors from the area to build the camp, and in 6 months those contractors built the 1,000 buildings, and by the end of October of 1942 men began arriving for training. And now Camp Hale 2 has a fun Colorado connection in its name. The camp is named for General Irving Hale, who was a Spanish-American war hero and general from Denver. And so he was also the founder of the Veterans of Foreign Affairs, so the VFW. And so that was a kind of a fun connection when they were choosing the name for the camp. And in today's money, or back then, it cost a total of $30 million to construct. So in today's money, that's over $565 million. So it was the most expensive encampment built during World War II here in the United States. Yeah. Now, life at Camp Hale was like a small city. They had all, within the 1,000 buildings, they had mess halls, infirmaries, even a ski shop, a general store, service clubs, field houses, and even a movie theater for entertainment, the barracks, a fire station, 2 chapels, and even stables for the livestock. So they had to have basically anything and everything that the soldiers might need because, as you've seen, Camp Hale is pretty remote. The closest towns were Vail and Leadville, and it was a couple-hour train ride to get back down to Denver. So they had to have everything they might need, both for daily functioning and for recreation. Now, there were over 15,000 personnel at its height there at the camp. And in Colorado at the time, it made it a very small city. It was one of the biggest towns in the state at the time, which is kind of funny, even though it only existed for 2 years. And now, the men, while they were there, their daily routine definitely involved inspections, training, drills, as well as specific technical training in skiing, mountaineering, and artillery. But they did have some fun while they were up there. They could earn weekend passes where they could go off and visit the towns of Vail, Leadville, and Denver. It's kind of fun, colorful history, part of the camp. Leadville was closed several times to the 10th Mountain Men because, as you might know, it has a very colorful history, and Army officials were worried about its influence on the men's morality. So it's one of the few times where an actual town is barred from the men rather than the men being barred from the town. Yeah. And so, the men also too would go on weekend trips, going on camping trips and ski trips through the Colorado Rockies, many of them climbing the 14ers that surround the camp itself, which is pretty cool. And to stay up to date on what life was going on in the camp, announcements, celebrations, and events, they had their own camp newspaper called the Camp Hale Ski-Zette, and that's how they stayed up to date through their 2 years there at the camp. And now many of the soldiers, especially during this time, needed to stay connected with family back at home. And they mainly did that through mail services. They did have a phone office there where they could make calls, but it was very expensive, and they would only really get about a minute or two to chat with their family after waiting in a line maybe for a couple hours. So it was much easier to communicate back home with their family via mail. And now this is where we get to the story of the WACs, because at its height there were 13,500 men, and the other personnel that made up the camp population included civilians, but also a detachment of 200 women from the Women's Army Corps. And so to talk about, how they got involved in the Army during World War II and how they eventually got assigned to Camp Hale, we have to go back and talk about the history of women serving in the armed forces and the creation of the Corps as a whole. And so for over 200 years, women have actually been serving in the United States military, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. Now, before, and actually it wasn't until after World War II, women were not officially allowed to enlist in the Army. And if they did volunteer their service, they could not serve in a combat role. So back in early conflicts, women would be following the camps, serving as cooks, laundresses, and mainly as nurses for the men coming off the front lines. And as the need for them developed, a lot of them also become spies and intelligence gatherers, being able to sneak into camps or use their position to gather intelligence for the military, which is really cool. There were even several instances where women dressed up as men and disguised themselves and joined the Army in several light infantry units or as spies, which is really cool. So they have, for 200 years, been volunteering their service to help support their country. And where this really is seen, especially, is during World War I. There are over 35,000 women who joined the war effort in the Army during World War I, mainly as nurses, administrators, secretaries, telephone operators, and even architects. And then there are even women at home serving on the home front, filling in factory jobs and as engineers and in industries that were predominantly male dominated. And because as the men went off to fight, there were labor shortages. And so during this conflict, all of these women are volunteering their service, but they are not being treated fairly. If they're being sent overseas, these women had to find their own lodging and food. They were not getting paid fairly, as well as they didn't have protections if they were captured by the enemy. So there were no legal protections for them overseas, and if they were unfortunately killed in action, there were no death benefits for their families, or if they were injured, no disability benefits and pensions for them when they returned to civilian life. And so one woman who paid attention to that and wanted to change that, especially for World War II, anticipating that we were going to go to war and that women were going to be needed for the war effort, and that woman was Congresswoman Edith Rogers. And so she saw, that there was likely going to be a need for women to support the war effort, that there were going to be labor shortages, and she wanted to make sure that they were going to be treated fairly this time around. And even alone, in World War II, over 150,000 women end up volunteering their service to the WACs alone, out of the 350,000 women who volunteer their service overall, which is huge, the huge part of the war effort. And so they do have a very similar start, like the 10th Mountain Division. So recognizing that war was on the horizon, Congresswoman Rogers introduces a bill in May of 1941 to Congress proposing the creation of, at this time, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And so she meets with George C. Marshall to talk about that, because he's the Army Chief of Staff at the time, and he was the man to get things done. And so she was very determined that women this time around would have equal pay, equal protection, and equal pensions and benefits. And he was very on board with that. Marshall also believed that if there was going to be a two-front war, which ends up being the case, there was going to be a manpower shortage, and women were going to be necessary for that war effort. So he helped support her in Congress to get that bill pushed through and passed, which was huge. And now, it wasn't, though, seriously considered really for months. Many men in Congress believed that women still should belong in the home as home caregivers, belonging with the family, that they didn't belong in the military service. And it wasn't until Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th in 1941 that their attitudes began to change. And so Congress eventually passed the bill on May 14th of 1942, and FDR signed it into law on the 15th, and that officially created the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And now, this huge win for women in the military service, but Rogers did have to make some concessions in order to get the bill passed. The main one was that she believed that the women should be serving in the Army as a part of, like, say, a reserve corps in the Army itself. And again, they should be receiving equal pay, pensions, and disability benefits. The Army did not agree with her. Were not ready to integrate women into the ranks, and rather wanted to treat the Army Corps as like a partner organization. So the way they signed it in, the women would be serving along the Army rather than for them, similar to like how the American Red Cross works. And so with this final bill, it established that, one, they would be serving alongside the Army, two, the Army in return would be providing up to 150,000 auxiliaries, so it's another word for volunteers, with food, uniforms, living quarters, pay, and medical care, which again was a huge victory because those were all things that women were lacking when they were serving in the Army during World War I. And some failures that came out from this bill, though, were that women officers were not allowed to command men. So they could be commanded by male officers, depending on where they were assigned, but they had no authority over the soldiers at the camps where they were at. And two, because of that, their ranks were not equivalent to the Army rank of their male counterparts. And so, for example, the director of the WAC, she was assigned the rank of major, which would have been equivalent to a colonel. WAC officers would have been the equivalents to captains and lieutenants, and because of that, they did receive less pay than their male counterparts. So some failures there, but we finally have a dedicated Army Corps to women's service at this time. And another big failure, though, too, which eventually gets resolved, is that it failed to provide overseas pay, government life insurance, veterans medical coverage, and death benefits. That does eventually get corrected, though. And the Army's not the only one that takes advantage of recruiting women into going into some kind of volunteer or reserve corps attached to them. Each branch has their own volunteer corps. So the Navy has the WAVES, the Air Force has the WASPs, and the Marines have the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. So they're all recognizing how important women are going to be towards the war effort for their own individual branches, which is huge at the time. And now, the first director who is assigned to the WACs, her name is Ovette Culp Hobby. She's a congresswoman from Texas at the time, and she's appointed the first director and becomes instrumental in the recruitment and public image of the WAC as an organization. And I'll kind of get to that here. When they were first created, FDR set a recruitment goal of 25,000 women by the first year, and they exceed that goal within the first 6 months, so much that they have to change it to 150,000 women. Yeah, so women are coming out to join the WACs. And their official symbol, which I have here printed, is the Pallas Athene. So it's the goddess Athena, who is the goddess of victory and womanly virtue. And so this is the official symbol for the WACs. It is a gold pin that they would wear either on their lapels or, while up at Camp Hale, would be used as building signs to identify where the WAC barracks and service club is at. So we'll kind of see this pop up back throughout the story, but this is what their symbol looks like. And now we get to recruitment. And so the goal was to recruit women from all over the country to join this war effort, and they really do. So once they're established, they need to select a training site for these women, and the first training site is built in Fort Des Moines, Iowa. And once they open the applications in the summer of 1942, they get over 35,000 women applying for the less than 1,000 positions that they anticipated creating. So a lot of women are trying to sign up for this, which is great. And that's largely due to Director Hobby herself really advocating for the WAC in newspaper and radio coverage. As well as just general interest, because there were a lot of doubters. A lot of people were very critical about the women's role in the military and what she could actually do for the Army. So the WACs were definitely up against a huge challenge, but were very willing to prove themselves. Yes, there was a lot of high pressure. And what's really, really unique about this too is that it drew a lot of women from small to mid-sized towns from around the country. So a lot of women who might have not had employment opportunities back at home, but saw their chance to get out and develop these technical skills that the WACs were promising. So a lot of women from smaller towns volunteered to join the war effort, which is huge. And so for the application process itself, it was very similar to how they drafted men into the Army. So you had to be a U.S. citizen. You had to be a woman between the age of 21 and 45. But the key difference here is that you had to have no dependents. So if you were a mother who had children, you were not able to apply to join the WACs. You had to be at least 5 feet tall and weighing at least 100 pounds. And so, yeah, so had to have some weight. But so they found, though, that the average applicant was a woman of 25 years old. She had some kind of college training, had either been in college or had graduated from it, and was working as an office administrator, executive secretary, or a teacher. And so this was huge because Marshall, when signing off on the women joining the Army, felt that women were better suited for a lot of professional roles because they had the patience and temperament, which a lot of men lacked, so to do in, let's say, administrative roles, desk jobs, things that required a lot of patience. And so they definitely sought after women that had those necessary skills and temperament. And there are a lot of reasons why women chose to join the war effort. One being they found that 1 out of every 5 women who enlisted joined because they had a male family member. And so that could be a brother, a father, a boyfriend, or a husband in the armed forces. And she wanted to join to help him get home sooner, to bring an end to the war faster, faster by however means that she could do. Some of them, sadly, at this point, were already combat widows, losing husbands, brothers, boyfriends in Pearl Harbor and the invasion of Bataan. Some of them enlisted because they had sons or husbands who were disabled and were unable to fulfill their fighting duties. And some came from families with no men of a fighting age. So with families that were all girls, or maybe families where they were an only child. And so they saw it as their duty to step up and be that family member of a fighting age. But on all our applications, this was the main reason why the women joined the WACs. And it was they had the desire to aid their country in a time of need by releasing a man for combat duty. Yeah, and so the first pool of applicants began arriving at the training center in Fort Des Moines on July 20th, 1942. And so in that first pool, there were over 600 women who had joined. 440 were officer candidates, and 125 were enlisted or auxiliary women. And so those who had been enlisted, a lot of them came from the initial officer application period. They had been rejected as an officer, but were encouraged to still join rather than going back to their civilian life. And one really neat fact too, there were 40 black women in that first initial pool of officer candidates. So they trained together with the white officers there in the officer cadet candidate school. And then once they graduated, they were segregated off and became officers of their own black detachment. And so the black WACs were sent out and assigned to join the black troops in World War II, because the Army still at this time was segregated. And so the women were there for 6 weeks completing basic training, and this garnered a lot of media attention from around the country, so much so that reporters were flocking out there to get whatever footage and interviews that they could, highlighting or possibly shedding negative light on the WACs in their training efforts there. It got very busy to the point that they eventually had to bar reporters from entering the training site. So it definitely, people were fascinated on what the WACs are doing, so much so that they were even asking what kind of underwear they were going to be issued for their uniform, as the public wanted to know. But because so many women were applying to join, that by the end of 1942, 3 new training centers were opened around the country. One in Daytona Beach, Florida, another in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and the third in Fort Devens, Massachusetts. So they, so women, they, like I said, they had to increase the goal to 150,000. They had to support the war effort. And now, a lot of their daily training and routines were very similar to the men in the Army and what they were going through. Their daily routines included uniform and bunk inspections, daily chores, things like commissary and KP duty, but largely it involved taking courses on military education, a lot of the same ones that the men were going through. The only exception was combat education. So, for example, they are taking courses on military sanitation and first aid, military customs and courtesy, map reading, defense against chemical and air attacks, company and supply management, all kinds of things that would help build their technical skills and make them the specialists at whatever camp or fort that they were assigned to after basic training. And since this was the first time we have a dedicated women's volunteer corps in the Army, they had to create a standardized uniform that would be issued to all the women who joined. And now there was a lot of debate that occurred between Director Hobby and Army officials. Hobby was really set on having the uniform being distinct. There was an image they had to maintain, but the uniform needed to be functional for whatever position that the woman would be assigned to, but it had to stay feminine because they had to prove that they were still womanly and feminine and still could take on these jobs that were normally dedicated to a man. And so a lot of debate went into that. The one big one, funny enough, was over the color of the uniforms. Now, Army officials did not want them wearing the olive drab and khaki. They did not want them looking similar to the Army because technically they were not serving under it. They rather have them have their uniforms be navy blue. But due to supply demands and fabric shortages, they had to concede, and so the uniforms were olive drab and khaki, just like the Army. Yeah, funny enough. And so they were issued a lot of their standard issued uniform included a uniform dress jacket, a flared skirt, and this was also kind of a big point of debate. Because you might think, okay, well, they're going to be in the Army, they're serving as motor pool drivers and mechanics, you'd think they'd be wearing slacks. But they did settle on having them wear a skirt as their official uniform instead, which is, and you might think in today is kind of crazy. But many were encouraged to wear the skirt because, again, it helped them avoid looking masculine because they had to maintain that feminine image, for one. 2, they did believe that women weren't going to be involved in any outdoor activities, which, if you think about what they're doing up at Camp Hale, that's kind of very silly. They're out there in freezing cold temperatures in their knee-length skirt. And I have photographs you can come up and see afterwards that prove that. They had leggings, so they were issued nylon stockings and thicker leggings for the winter and boots, but their legs were exposed. Yeah, and it was mainly down to a comfort level. So like I mentioned, a lot of these women are coming from small towns and so are very used to wearing dresses and skirts. And so the idea of wearing a pair of slacks did not make them comfortable. So many women still chose to wear a skirt over a pair of pants. As we see throughout the war, those attitudes do begin to change, and many women do eventually become comfortable wearing a pair of slacks, and that kind of influences fashion trends going into the 50s and 60s. And now other things they would have been issued, coveralls. That was the solution. If they had to work outside, they had to do something that was going to be dirty, they were issued a pair of coveralls, which are jumpsuits or overalls. So you see a lot of women wearing those, not only in the Army itself, but women serving in factories and, or, you know, working in the home front at the time. Very Rosie the Riveter-like. There are other things issued. They're also wearing hats like the men. They're issued overseas caps, which are garrison caps. A lot of the enlisted women are issued those, while officers are issued visor caps. So that's how you can kind of tell the difference. But they also had their own Army insignia and pins that they would wear on their left sleeves to identify their ranking, just like the men themselves. So being issued chevrons to identify their rank, overseas stripes for how long they served, and bars that would go on their epaulets if they were an officer. One big thing that I think is kind of funny that they were issued, though, is each woman was issued a handbag, because even back then, women's clothing and uniforms were not designed with pockets. So they had to have handbags to carry their personal effects. And now, to maintain that feminine image too, women were allowed to wear makeup and nail polish and had to routinely keep their hair done, because that helped keep the feminine image. And all of the training sites had beauty shops where they could go get their hair and nails done. Yeah, so it's kind of funny. So once they complete their basic training, all of the women are assigned to different Army units around the country and then later on overseas. And so at the time, the Army was divided into 3 components. So you have the Army Air Forces, so it seems like the Army Air Corps. You have the Army Ground Forces, which are the tank divisions. And then you have the Army Service Forces. So that is ensuring basically everything else that doesn't necessarily fall under ground forces or air forces. And a breakdown of where all the WACs were sent off. 40% were sent to the Army Air Forces, 40% were sent to the Army Service Forces, and 20% were sent to the Army Ground Forces. And now at the beginning, most of the auxiliaries were working in jobs as file clerks, typists, stenographers, or motor pool drivers. But their roles are eventually expanded because Army officials see how useful these women can be. And so, for example, in the Army Air Forces, they are eventually working in professional roles as weather observers and forecasters, radio operators and repairmen, parachute riggers and link trainer instructors, and even as bomb site maintenance specialists and control tower operators. So they're instrumental in, even to the point of deciding flight paths and communicating those to Army pilots, which is really cool. For the Army Service Forces, who happen to be the detachment that get assigned to Camp Hale, they were working in roles as Service Command, Supply, and Arms Services specialists. So the ASF was divided into 6 departments. So you have all kinds of special technicians and specialists within that. So there's the Ordnance Department. So you have women working as ammunition specialists and testers, mechanics, electricians, and even ordnance engineers. So building the the rounds and the artillery that is going and being issued to the men on the front lines. You have the Transportation Corps. And so those women, you get women in the Motor Corps, so working as motor pool drivers and mechanics. But you also have women processing the men for overseas assignments, handling personnel files, and even issuing weapons to the men before they go overseas. You have women assigned to the Chemical Warfare Service. So they're in laboratories inventing and testing gear and equipment that eventually is getting sent out to the men either in the Pacific or Europe, which is huge again. Very, very instrumental in that war effort regarding that. You have the Quartermaster Corps, where they're working as supply inspectors and managers, so making sure everything is ordered and the camps themselves are getting all of the necessary supplies they need to function. You have the Signal Corps, which the women are working as telephone switchboard operators, radio operators, photographers, and map analysts, which is huge. So many women are assigned as photographers, learning how to develop photographs and negatives, which become useful especially in reconnaissance missions. So being able to develop aerial photographs that are taken to help the soldiers plot out potential plans for attack, and being able to read those maps and helping them analyze, the given information that they have received and recorded, which is, again, huge supportive effort. And the last one is the medical corps. So you have women working as nurses in infirmaries and laboratories at all of these different camps. And then, so you have all of this positivity from those first two, and then we get to the Army Ground Forces, and there the WACs receive the most resistance from Army officials. The Army Ground Forces were very resistant to the use of women. That's why only really 20% end up going there, and if they do get sent there, they're working menial jobs in offices as file clerks and typists mainly. They are discriminated against and were not treated very well if they were assigned to those divisions, to the point that a lot of women who were there spoke on their experience after the fact, saying that there was little room for transfer, promotion, and the ability to become a specialist. So they were not treated very well if you got sent to the AGF. And now, within those first 6 months, once the women eventually went out to their assignments, the WACs exceeded expectations for the Army officials. They proved how valuable they were, and so in January of 1943, Congresswoman Rogers reintroduces her original bill to create the Women's Army Corps, because at this time we're still the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And so in this bill, she is pushing that Congress permits the enlistment and commissioning of women into the Army as a reserve force. And so this would drop the auxiliary from the title, and it would allow women to serve overseas with full benefits, which again was something that failed in the first bill. And on July 1st of 1943, that bill passes and FDR signs it into legislation. And so that officially changes the WAAC to the Women's Army Corps, or the WAC. And so they become an official part of the U.S. Army as a reserve corps. And this gave women equal rank, privileges, pay, and benefits of their male counterparts, which is a huge victory. For example, Director Hobby is finally promoted to colonel rather than major. All WAC officers become either captains, first lieutenants, or second lieutenants. Company commanders become captains or majors. And the enlisted women could earn the rank of master sergeant. And so that is where this leads into our case study today, which are the WACs at Camp Hale. And now, the WACs, we don't know really a lot about their time at Camp Hale specifically. The records were not kept very well. They either were destroyed, or just not a lot of women necessarily spoke about their experience up there at the camp. And so what we do know come from letters from the women themselves, or men, 10th Mountain soldiers writing home about them. We know a lot from a photo collection that we recently discovered. It is at the Colorado Snow Sports Museum in Vail, but I have photocopies of it today. It comes from a WAC named Mary Davis, who was stationed up at Camp Hale during World War II. And the third way we know come from a lot of news articles published in the Camp Hale Skizette. So the WACs had their own news column in the newsletter. Actually, two of them. One was called Bless 'em the WACs, and the other one was the DEET WAC, or the Detachment WACs. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today come from those newsletters mainly. And so the first detachment of WACs arrive at Camp Hale on May 27th, 1943. So officially, they're coming in as WAAC members, because this is about a month and a half before they're officially signed in as WACs. In that first detachment, there are 12 enlisted women and 2 officers. And they're coming in droves, though, because it's only a few short weeks later when we start getting women from the Motor Corps joining Camp Hale. And then eventually the total, overall 200 women coming and getting assigned to the camp. I want to read an excerpt from, I guess, this is one of the first excerpts that we see wax popping up in the Skizette. And it was published on June 16th, 1943, and it says, "Thank loads for the wonderful reception shown us since our arrival here. We are both glad and proud to be here and hope to prove ourselves capable of the work we are about to undertake. One of the most frequent questions asked us is, how do you like Camp Hale? Speaking for all, it reminds us of Lost Horizon, but we love it." Yeah, so it felt like they were going to another world, that they were at a lost city, basically. Because if you think about it, in these total 200 women, there are 45 out of the 48 states represented in the group that is there. And for many of these women, that means this is their first time seeing the mountains, and especially the majestic Rocky Mountains, and seeing snow for the first time. So it was another world experience for them. At the camp, the women had their own barracks building and their own service club that was affectionately coined the Whack Shack. And so on all of their assigned buildings, you would find the Palace Athene there to identify them. Very similar to how all the 10th Mountain buildings were assigned. Each regiment and company had their own identification sign to identify where their barracks were at, so they were treated the same that way. Just like at the service clubs issued to the 10th Mountain men, they could hold performances and dances at their service club, and even had a concession stand where they could buy soda, beer, cigarettes, candies, and chips. So to have some comforts of home there during their free time. And now, these men were not, the 10th Mountain soldiers were not allowed to enter their barracks, but they could be invited as dates or escorts to the many dances that the women threw during their time at Camp Hale. And so a lot of them form friendships and do go on to date and get married. And I will talk a little bit about that. And so, perfect lead in. During their 18-month assignment at the camp, the 10th Mountain men were very excited to have the ladies there. And for the most part, they got along well during their time at Camp Hale. They organized many social events, so things like picnics, dances, variety shows, so that they can, recreate together, but also as a form of, as a way to boost morale. Because the men had been there and were there for 2 years training, and morale was pretty low because during those 2 years, Army officials had no idea where they were going to use this mountain warfare division. They were technically a light infantry division, so they were at 13,500 men rather than the base number for a division, which was 15,000. And so they had lighter artillery, and so Army officials were like, you have less men and less firepower, we are not going to be able to use them. And so that's why it takes them so long to be deployed until 1945, when the opportunity arose in northern Italy there. And so, yeah, the WACs were a big part of boosting morale. Talking about camp variety skits, they were known for their Camp Hale and Hardy and the Camp Hale variety shows. So variety shows they'd host with the men, where they'd sing, dance, and perform comedy skits. They also, though, while they were there, many of the women took up a love for the outdoors, just like the 10th Mountain soldiers. I have read a news article here published on June 25th, 1943. Mountain climbing seems to be a new sport taken up by the WACs. It's all right, girls, and loads of fun, provided you have a master cook with you. And I hear tell that most of the soldiers are good cooks. Don't let them talk you into eating mountain rations either. Yeah, and so you'll see in the photographs here, the women got involved in camping, in hiking, rock climbing, and even skiing. In a Blessum article written on March 24th, 1944, a WAC comments that detachment, we foresee from the sunburns and sore muscles a team in formation for, should we say, the 1960 Olympics? Yeah. So the women were out there skiing with them. Some even got involved with the care of the mules and horses, making sure that those mule recruits were being taken care of. And just like their 10th Mountain men, they would go on weekend trips with their 10th Mountain friends and beaus, either on camping trips or to go visit towns like Vail and Denver. And so this is where we see, you'll see in the photographs here, many of them would go on camping trips with their boyfriends. And now dating was allowed. It wasn't frowned upon, but it was highly encouraged to maintain a sense of professionalism because there was such high pressure from the media to maintain a certain image. A lot of doubt early on came from the media about potentially these immoral women that were going to be coming out of the camps. And so that was a big image issue, even to the point that if a WAC did fall pregnant, she would be immediately discharged. So you could not have a dependent, and it would hurt the image if that came out. And so the women did have to be careful. But a lot of relationships came out of their time there at Camp Hale, and many women got married to 10th Mountain men that they met at the camp. There's even records in the Skizette of wedding ceremonies that were held there and dances to celebrate the new unions. And a lot of the times in the news article, you'd see congratulatory messages to whatever new WAC and soldier that might have gotten married. And another way these women stayed involved during their time up at Camp Hale was actually through their own radio show, which is really cool. They had a Sunday broadcast show that they would do from their service club called Their Day, and it would be broadcasted over KOA Denver. So even people down in Denver could be hearing what life was like for the WACs up at Camp Hale. And so they would tell the history of the WACs, they would talk about events and their time up at the camp, and they would even sing camp songs on the radio broadcast. And so, yeah, it's another way they shared and made their presence known up there at the camp. And now their daily routine was very similar to the 10th Mountain men. They had their own training and drills that they had to complete, and inspections, both uniform and bunks. In a news article published on January 14th, 1944, one 10th Mountain soldier writes about how the men get a kick out of watching the women complete their calisthenics training at 6 a.m. out in the yard, watching them flail their arms in the wintry cold air. Women also completed chores. They had regular assigned chore duty, and one including KP duty, which is kitchen patrol. So they could be seen out there peeling carrots and potatoes with the 10th Mountain soldiers. So they pulled their own weight when they're assigned at Camp Hale. And then you might be wondering, well, they're taking advantage of all these outdoor activities. Are they doing them in skirts? When they were on duty, the women still elected to wear their skirt over pants. But many of them do end up wearing, borrowing used pants and snow pants from the 10th Mountain soldiers to wear while camping or skiing or hiking. And you'll see that in the photographs that I have brought here today. And when it comes to their assigned jobs at the camp, they worked in a variety of roles underneath that Army Service Force branch. The women at the camp and in the WACs overall were very intelligent and purposeful. They understood the magnitude of the war despite all the jests and criticisms that they received from the media and the soldiers themselves. The WACs at the camp were seen working all over, as one 10th Mountain put it, from 20th Street to headquarters in Pando. There at the camp was managed by the 7th Service Command. So that was the larger administrative region that would make sure that all administrative functioning was being maintained. And so many of these women got assigned to professional and specialist roles underneath the 7th Service Command. So you might notice in the photographs that on their uniforms, they don't actually wear the 10th Mountain Division logo. They don't get the powder keg with the cross bayonets because they're technically under the command of the 7th Service Command. And so they're there working in the headquarters building as personnel, finance, post-exchange, and special service specialists. And so that can be things like post-exchange officers working on circulars, special orders, and daily bulletin distribution, or as mail orderlies, so making sure that mail is being sent off and received correctly so that the men stay connected with their families at home. You have finance officers handling reports, rosters, and payroll. Things even like one woman worked as a court reporter at the Camp Judge Advocate's office. So they're filling all kind of specialist roles, more than just working as file clerks and typists. Though those were still very important roles, not to underplay that. In the ordnance department, the women are working as mechanics or in the ordnance maintenance shop, or they're working as photographers and supply clerks in the general store. Even in the motor corps, they're working as mechanics and motor pool drivers for the Jeeps and staff vehicles. And as part of the Signal Corps, they are working as telegraph and telephone operators, known as hello girls by the men at the camp. They're helping the men stay connected with home. And then too, weather observers and forecasters was a very important role up the camp, because as you can imagine, the weather changes very quickly up here. And so if they're going out to participate in winter training series, like the D series, they needed these women to be able to forecast potential weather, storms coming in and weather changes. And their service does not go unrecognized. In April of 1944, over 100 WACs are awarded the Good Conduct Medal for their service to Camp Hale, which is huge. And so in the summer of 1944, D-Day happens there in June, and at that point, Army officials decide that 10th Mountain is not going to be able to be used as a winter warfare unit, so they're reassigned to Camp Swift, which is where they're transferred to at the end of the summer. And so that leads to the end of the WACs at Camp Hale. They are transferred out in September of 1944, and the majority of them are sent to Camp Crowder, Missouri, where they spend the rest of their war service at. Some of them do get transferred to the Pacific to serve in overseas positions, and though some actually do stay here in Denver working at Fitzsimmons Hospital, which is interesting, but none of them stay with the division. They do not get sent over with them to Italy when they go off to combat in 1945. And now kind of leads to the end of our WAC story. Post that, we don't know too much about what these women did post-war. I mean, I'm hoping a lot of them, especially if they married 10th Mountain soldiers, got involved in the descendant organization, going on those reunion trips and going to the reunion meetings nationally. But this is exciting because this has opened the door, though, for a lot of research into these women's service period to highlight and honor their dedication and service to not only Camp Hale, but to the Army and the country during World War II. And I have a great poem here to read for you to kind of end this story about their time at Camp Hale. And so this poem was written by Tech 3 Lillian McCormick, and it was published as the WAC's farewell to the camp in the September 30th, 1944 Skizette. It is called Beauteous Burden. My heart has grown so much since I came here, beyond all reason and all natural course, that is great enough to take and hold these mountains in unending memory. Elbert, wearing mourning, wearing snow, still and splendid, proud beyond belief, scorning his sister massive for her friendly bulk and eagerness to talk to strangers. It can enfold these near and candid skies, hovering in beauty, prodigal with stars, so close they could be taken with the hand. But that the flowers of heaven, like the columbine, sacred to Colorado, are inviolable. My heart can hold the souvenir of spring, more startled, sweeter here than anywhere, setting her slender feet in stubborn snows, timid, unsure of welcome, winsome slowly, sifting her magic on the indifferent earth until it stirs in wonder and embraces her. My heart can compass aspens in the autumn, like gold torches set against the dark, impenetrable evergreens that march bravely upward to the conquering timberline. In winter, imperial, walking strangely, purely, trailing his ermine from the valley floor to ptarmigan's tall top. My heart can take and hold these things, and yet I am afraid. Descending from such heights with such a burden, the human heart is fragile and may break. And that's the story of the WACs at Camp Hale.
Cool.